The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky surface of planet Zephoria as Staff Sergeant Jake Rodriguez checked his equipment one final time. His team had been exploring this distant world for 3 weeks now, mapping the terrain and studying the strange crystal formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why Jake had been with the Terran Defense Corps for 8 years. He'd seen his share of unexplored worlds, but Zephoria held mysteries that kept him awake at night. The way the crystals hummed with energy, the perfectly preserved structures that looked ancient yet somehow timeless, and the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. Rodriguez take point on the eastern ridge came the voice of Captain Williams through his comm device. "We're picking up some unusual energy readings from those ruins you spotted yesterday." Jake nodded and separated from his squad, making his way through the maze of crystal spires that jutted from the planet's surface like frozen lightning. The ruins in question were about 2 miles from their base camp, nestled in a valley where the crystal formations grew thicker and more vibrant. As he walked, his boots crunched softly on the strange, sand-like substance that covered the ground here. The structures ahead looked like nothing he'd seen before. They weren't built from stone or metal, but seemed to be grown from the same crystalline material as the natural formations around them. Walls curved and twisted in impossible ways, creating doorways that led deeper into the complex. Everything glowed with a soft, blue-white light that made his scanner readings go crazy. Jake paused at what might have been an entrance, though it was hard to tell where the natural cave system ended and the artificial construction began. His training told him to wait for backup, but something about this place called to him. The energy readings were stronger here, almost like a heartbeat in the walls themselves. He stepped inside, weapon ready, but not raised. The space opened up into a vast chamber, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Crystalline formations hung like chandeliers, casting dancing patterns of light across walls covered in what looked like writing. Though unlike any language he'd ever seen, the symbols seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. That's when he heard it. Sound like wind chimes mixed with distant music. Too soft to be a threat, but definitely not natural. Jake froze, listening carefully. Heart pounded as he realized he wasn't alone in this place. From behind one of the larger crystal formations stepped a figure that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She was clearly not human, but beautiful in a way that transcended species. Tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to shimmer with the same inner light as the crystals around them. Her hair moved as if underwater, floating gently around a face with large, expressive eyes that held intelligence and curiosity rather than fear. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Jake's training screamed at him to raise his weapon, to call for backup, to follow protocol. But something in those eyes stopped him. This wasn't a threat. This was first contact with an intelligent species, and how he handled the next few minutes might determine the future relationship. Between their peoples, the alien woman took a tentative step forward. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. She wore robes that seemed to be cut from the same crystalline material as the walls, flowing and changing color as she moved. When she spoke, her voice was like music, though the words were completely foreign to him. Jake slowly raised his hands, palms open, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she mimicked the gesture. Then she did something that surprised him even more. She pointed to herself and spoke a single word that sounded like flowing water over stones. Then she pointed to him with a questioning look. "Jake," he said simply, pointing to himself. "My name is Jake." The woman's face lit up with what could only be described as delight. She repeated his name, though it came out sounding more musical. In her voice, then she spoke her own name again, more slowly this time. Sounded like Zara to his ears, though he suspected the real pronunciation was more complex than his human vocal cords could manage. They spent the next few minutes pointing. 2 objects around the chamber and exchanging words. Jake learned that the crystal formations were called something that translated roughly to songstones in his mind, though he wasn't sure how he knew that. Zara seemed to understand his words faster than should have been possible, as if she was reading his thoughts somehow. When she gestured toward his sidearm with curiosity rather than fear, Jake hesitated. Weapons were a sensitive subject in first contact situations, but there was something about Zara's expression, a genuine desire to understand rather than to threaten, that made him reconsider. Slowly, carefully, Jake drew his weapon and held it where she could see it clearly. Zara stepped closer, her eyes studying the device with intense interest. Jake engaged the safety and demonstrated how to hold it properly, his hands guiding hers into the correct position. "Pull the trigger softly," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand the words yet. Something about her presence made him want to speak gently, to share knowledge rather than display power. As her finger found the trigger, he covered her hand with his own, showing her the gentle pressure needed. The weapon clicked harmlessly, and Zara's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire chamber.
Oh.
In that moment, Jake realized that this wasn't just first contact between species. This was the beginning of something that could change both their worlds forever. But even as he shared this moment of connection with Zara, Jake knew that others of both their kinds might not be so understanding. The path ahead would be filled with challenges, misunderstandings, and those who feared what they didn't know. Yet looking into Zara's eyes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years of military service. Hope for a future where different species could learn from each other instead of fighting. 3 days had passed since Jake's first encounter with Zara, and he found himself counting the hours until he could return to the Crystal Caves. He'd managed to slip away each evening, telling his team he was conducting additional security sweeps of the area. The lie sat heavy on his conscience, but he knew that reporting the contact too early might ruin everything. The meeting place they'd chosen was deeper in the cave system, in a chamber Zara had shown him that was filled with smaller crystals that chimed softly when touched. She'd somehow made it clear that this was a safe space, hidden from the eyes of her own people just as much as from his. The crystals here glowed more gently, creating an atmosphere that felt peaceful rather than mysterious. Jake arrived first this time, carrying a small pack of items he'd brought to share. He'd spent hours thinking about what might help bridge the gap between their species. Simple things, mostly pictures of Earth, basic tools, food that wouldn't spoil. He wanted to show Zara that humans were more than just soldiers with weapons. When she appeared, seeming to materialize from the shadows between the crystals, Jake noticed she looked different, less formal somehow. Instead of the flowing robes she'd worn before, she was dressed in something that reminded him of comfortable work clothes, though made from that same shimmering material. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she moved with less of the careful grace he'd seen during their first meeting. "Jake," she said, and his name sounded more natural in her voice now. Over the past few days, their communication had improved dramatically. She seemed to absorb new words and concepts with amazing speed, while he struggled to wrap his tongue around even the simplest phrases in her language. "Zara," he replied, setting down his pack, "I brought some things to show you." She settled beside him on the smooth crystal floor, her curiosity evident. Jake pulled out a small photo album, real printed pictures, not digital ones. He'd learned that the energy fields in the caves played havoc with electronic devices, but simple, mechanical things worked fine. The first picture showed Earth from space, that famous blue marble shot that had inspired generations of explorers. Zara's eyes widened as she studied it, then looked at Jake with a question in her expression. "My home," he said simply. "Earth. Where I come from." She nodded slowly, then touched the crystal wall beside them. The wall began to glow, and suddenly Jake was looking at images that seemed to form in the crystal itself. Views of Zephyria from high above, showing the vast crystal forests and floating cities he'd only heard rumors about. The beauty of it took his breath away. "Your home is beautiful," he managed to say, and the smile that lit up her face told him she understood. They spent the next hour sharing pictures and stories. Jake showed her images of his family, his hometown, even some shots of his military training. Zara seemed particularly fascinated by the pictures of Earth's animals, especially the horses. She kept coming back to those photos, studying them with intense interest. In return, she shared more visions through the crystals. Jake saw glimpses of Zephyrian daily life, people who looked like Zara, moving through crystal halls, tending to gardens that grew in impossible geometric patterns. Children playing games that involved making the crystals sing in harmony. It was a peaceful world, one that seemed to value beauty and harmony above all else. But Jake also noticed something else in the crystal visions. When Zara showed him images of herself, she was always surrounded by others who treated her with deep respect, almost reverence. She wore elaborate robes and jewelry that marked her as someone important. It dawned on him that his new friend might be more than just a curious citizen of her world. "You're important to your people," he said carefully. "Like a leader." Zara's expression grew complicated. She touched the crystal wall again. This time the images showed vast halls filled with Zephyrians, all looking toward a figure that could only be Zara herself. She was addressing them, her posture confident and commanding. But Jake could see something in her projected image that reminded him of a bird in a cage. "Princess," she said finally, using the English word. "But I want to learn? Want to see beyond the crystal walls?" Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been having secret meetings with what amounted to alien royalty. If either of their peoples found out, it could be seen as everything from a security breach to an act of war. But looking at Zara's face, seeing the genuine curiosity and longing for knowledge there, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "I understand," he said. "Sometimes the most important people are the ones who feel the most trapped." She smiled at that, a sad but grateful expression. Then she gestured toward his pack. "What else did you bring?" Jake pulled out one of his training knives, a simple but well-balanced blade. Zara's eyes fixed on it immediately, not with fear, but with professional interest. Over the past few days, she'd made it clear that she wanted to learn about human ways of defending themselves. Her people, she'd explained, relied on their mental abilities and the protection of their crystal technology. The idea of physical self-defense was foreign but fascinating to her. "This is different from your weapon," she said, referring to the sidearm he'd shown her during their first meeting. "Different uses," Jake agreed. "This is for close protection, when you need to be quiet or when your main weapon isn't available." He spent the next 30 minutes teaching her basic knife handling, how to hold it safely, how to move with it, how to use it defensively rather than aggressively. Zara was a quick learner, her natural grace translating well to the fluid movements. He showed her. But more than that, she seemed to understand the philosophy behind what he was teaching. "It's not about hurting others," she said as she practiced a defensive stance. "It's about protecting yourself and those you care about." "Exactly," Jake replied, impressed by how quickly she grasped the concept. "The best fight is the one you never have to have." As their session came to an end, Zara looked at him with an expression that seemed to hold both gratitude and determination. "My people think humans are dangerous," she said quietly. "But you're teaching me that strength can be gentle, that weapons can be tools of protection, not just destruction." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "And you're teaching me that there are species out there who value wisdom over warfare. Maybe our peoples have more to learn from each other than we thought." As they prepared to leave their hidden sanctuary, both of them knew that their friendship was becoming something larger than either had expected. They were no longer just two individuals sharing knowledge. They were becoming bridges between worlds that had never truly understood each other. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their secret meetings couldn't last forever. Eventually, someone would notice his absences or discover their hiding place. When that happened, he could only hope that the trust they were building would be strong enough to survive the storm that was sure to follow. 2 weeks had passed since Jake and Zara began their secret meetings, and their friendship had grown into something neither had expected. What started as simple curiosity had become a deep connection that transcended the boundaries between their species. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening meetings more than anything else in his day. And he could see the same anticipation in Zara's eyes when she arrived at their hidden chamber. Tonight was different, though. Zara had asked him to meet her in a new location, somewhere she called the Gallery of Memories. Jake followed her directions through passages he'd never seen before, deeper into the crystal cave system than he'd ever ventured. The walls here were covered with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories, and the crystals themselves hummed with a different kind of energy. When he finally found the chamber Zara had described, Jake stopped in his tracks. The room was massive, with a ceiling that soared high above them, supported by natural crystal pillars. But what took his breath away were the walls themselves. They were covered in what could only be described as living art, images that moved and changed, showing scenes from Zephyrian history and culture. "Welcome to our memory keeper," Zara said, her voice filled with pride. "This is where we store the stories of our people, going back thousands of years." Jake walked slowly around the chamber, watching scenes play out on the crystal walls. He saw the early days of Zephyrian civilization, when they first learned to work with the crystals. He watched the development of their cities, the growth of their art and music, the peaceful moments that defined their culture. It was like watching a movie, but one that responded to his presence and interest. "This is incredible," he breathed. "You can actually preserve memories in the crystals." Zara nodded, touching one of the wall panels. "Not just preserve them, we can share them, experience them as if they were our own." "Would you like to try?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer to the wall. Zara guided his hand to rest on the smooth crystal surface, and suddenly he was no longer just watching the scenes, he was living them. He felt the joy of a Zephyrian child discovering they could make the crystals sing. He experienced the wonder of the first architects who learned to grow buildings from crystal formations. He felt the deep peace that came from being in harmony with their world. When the visions faded, Jake found himself with tears in his eyes. "I've never experienced anything like that," he said softly. "It's like I could feel what they felt, understand what they understood." "That's the gift of the crystals," Zara explained. "They don't just store information, they store emotions, experiences, the essence of what makes us who we are."
Oh.
"This is why my people are so connected to this world. We're not just living on it, we're part of it."
Wow.
Jake spent the next hour exploring the gallery of memories, learning about Zephyrian philosophy, art, and science, discovered that they had developed technology far beyond what humans had achieved. But they'd done it in harmony with their environment rather than at its expense. Their cities floated not through force, but through understanding the natural energy fields of their world. Their weapons were defensive, designed to protect rather than destroy. "Your people have found something my people are still searching for," Jake said as they sat together in the center of the chamber. "Balance. We're always fighting against our world, trying to control it, change it. You've learned to work with yours." Zara smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. "Not all of us feel that way. Some of my people believe that balance means isolation. They think contact with other species will corrupt our harmony." "Is that why you meet me in secret?" Jake asked. She nodded. "My father leads the council that governs our people. He believes that contact with outsiders will only bring conflict and destruction. He's seen what happened to other worlds when they encountered species that didn't share their values." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. "What about your military? Your weapons?" "We have defenses," Zara said carefully. "But they're not like yours. We can use the crystals to create shields, to confuse attackers, to make our cities invisible, if necessary. But we've never developed weapons designed to attack others. It goes against everything we believe." The weight of what she was saying hit Jake like a physical blow. His people had come to this world with military scouts, mapping, defenses, preparing for potential conflict. They saw the Zephyrians as a potential threat to be monitored and controlled. Meanwhile, the Zephyrians saw humans as dangerous outsiders who might destroy their peaceful way of life. "We're both afraid of the same thing," he realized. "We're both trying to protect our people from each other." Zara nodded, then stood and walked to another section of the crystal wall. "I want to show you something else," she said. "Something that gives me hope." The wall came alive with new images, but these weren't from the past. They showed possible futures, potential paths that could unfold. Jake saw humans and Zephyrians working together, sharing knowledge and technology. He saw human cities that incorporated crystal technology, creating harmony between civilization and nature. He saw Zephyrian explorers traveling to other worlds, sharing their wisdom and learning from other species. "These are possible?" he asked. "The crystals don't predict the future," Zara explained. "They show us what could be, based on the choices we make today. Every decision creates new possibilities." Jake studied the images more closely. In many of them, he could see himself and Zara, older but still working together, still building bridges between their peoples. But in others, he saw conflict and destruction, the result of fear and misunderstanding. "What we're doing matters," he said, understanding finally dawning. "These meetings, this friendship, it's not just about us." "No," Zara agreed.
Oh.
"About showing both our peoples that cooperation is possible, that understanding can overcome fear." They spent the rest of the evening sharing more personal stories. Jake told Zara about his childhood on Earth, about the dreams that had led him to become an explorer. Zara shared her own struggles with the expectations placed on her as a princess, her desire to see beyond the crystal walls of her world. As the night grew late, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just friends sharing knowledge, they had become partners in something much larger. They were working together to create a future that neither of their peoples had imagined possible. But as they prepared to leave the gallery of memories, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. His commanding officer had been asking questions about his extended patrols. Zara had mentioned that her father was becoming suspicious of her frequent absences from the palace.
Oh.
"What happens when they find out?" Jake asked as they stood at the entrance to the chamber. Zara's expression grew serious. "Then we'll have to convince them that the risk is worth it. That the future we're trying to build is better than the fear that divides us now." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They weren't just two individuals anymore. They were the bridge between worlds. And the fate of both their peoples might depend on the strength of that bridge. As they parted ways that night, both of them knew that the easy days of secret meetings and simple friendship were coming to an end. Soon, they would have to face the consequences of their choice to trust each other. But looking at the possible futures the crystals had shown them, Jake felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could help create a tomorrow worth fighting for. Jake knew something was wrong the moment he walked into the briefing room. Captain Williams sat at the head of the table, his expression harder than usual, while Lieutenant Torres avoided making eye contact. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Jake's heart began to race as he took his seat. "Rodriguez," Captain Williams began, his voice cold and professional. "We need to discuss your recent patrol activities." Jake kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. Had someone seen him entering the caves? Had his equipment been tracked? He'd been so careful to avoid the main surveillance routes, but maybe he'd missed something. "Sir," he replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. Williams slid a datapad across the table. On the screen were energy readings from Jake's equipment, showing the unusual signatures he'd encountered in the crystal caves. But more damning were the timestamps. They showed Jake's presence in areas he'd never officially reported visiting. "These readings don't match any of the locations in your patrol reports," Williams continued. "You've been somewhere you shouldn't have been, soldier. Multiple times." Jake stared at the data, his mind working quickly. He could lie, make up some story about equipment malfunction or unauthorized exploration. But looking at the evidence, he knew it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. And more importantly, he realized he didn't want to lie anymore. "I can explain, sir," he said carefully. "I certainly hope so," Williams replied, "because right now it looks like you've been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance, possibly compromising our mission security." Before Jake could respond, the communication system crackled to life. It was Colonel Anderson from the main base, his voice urgent and angry. "Williams, we have a problem. Aliens know about our presence here. They've been monitoring our activities and they're not happy about it." Jake's blood ran cold. If the Zephyrians had discovered the human presence, then Zara might be in danger too. Her own people would be asking questions about how the aliens had learned about the human scouts. "What's the situation, Colonel?" Williams asked. They made contact an hour ago. Appeared right outside our perimeter like ghosts. Their leader, some kind of princess, demanded to speak with whoever was responsible for the unauthorized meetings. With their people. Jake's heart stopped. Princess? They were talking about Zara. Somehow, her father had discovered their secret meetings. And now both of their peoples were facing the consequences. Sir, Jake said, standing up, I need to tell you something. Williams turned to him, his expression dangerous. I'm listening, Rodriguez. I've been meeting with one of them, the princess. It started as accidental contact, but we've been learning from each other. She's not a threat, sir. Her people aren't either. The silence in the room was deafening. Lieutenant Torres looked, shocked, while Captain Williams's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous calm. You've been what? Williams said quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. Building trust, sir? Learning about their culture, sharing information about ours? They're peaceful people. They're not our enemies. That's not your call to make, soldier. Williams exploded. You've compromised our entire mission. You've put every person on this planet at risk. Jake wanted to argue, to explain about the gallery of memories, about the possible futures he'd seen, about the friendship that had grown between him and Zara, but he could see from Williams's expression that explanations wouldn't help right now. Torres placed Rodriguez under arrest, Williams ordered. Unauthorized contact with hostile aliens, compromising mission security, failure to report, critical intelligence. Sir, they're not hostile, Jake said as Torres reluctantly moved to restrain him. If you just listen to what I've learned, what you've learned, Williams interrupted. Is that you're not cut out for this kind of work? Oh, you let your emotions override your training, and now we're all paying the price. As Torres led Jake toward the detention area. Jake's mind was filled with worry for Zara. If her father had discovered their meetings, she was probably facing the same kind of interrogation he was. Maybe worse, considering her position as princess. Meanwhile, in the Crystal Palace of the Zephyrians, Zara stood before the High Council, her father's disappointed gaze weighing heavily on her shoulders. The chamber was filled with the soft glow of memory crystals, but today, their light felt cold and accusatory. Daughter, her father said, his voice heavy with sadness rather than anger. The crystals have shown us your meetings with the human soldier. Why did you not come to us with this contact? Zara lifted her chin, drawing on the confidence Jake had helped her develop. Because I knew you would forbid it, father. And I believed. Then, as I believe now, that understanding between our peoples is possible. Understanding? Councilmember Thylan stepped forward, his elderly face creased with concern. Child, these humans came to our world with weapons and military scouts. They map our defenses and study our weaknesses. This is not the behavior of a peaceful species. One human, Zara corrected. One human who chose to put down his weapon and learn instead of fight. Who taught me that strength can be gentle, that different species can share knowledge without destroying each other. Her father touched a crystal panel. And the chamber filled with images of human military installations, weapons, and conflicts from their history. Look at their past, Zara. They are a species that solves problems through violence. They conquer and destroy rather than build and nurture. But Jake isn't like that, Zara insisted. He showed me pictures of his world, his family, his dreams. He taught me to defend myself, not to harm others, but to protect what I care about. He's trying to bridge the gap between our peoples. One individual cannot speak for an entire species, another council member said. What if this is all deception? What if he was sent to gain your trust, to learn our secrets? Zara felt a flash of anger. Then he would have tried to learn about our defenses, our weapons, our military capabilities. Instead, he wanted to understand our art, our culture, our values. He spent hours learning about our history, not our strategic weaknesses. The debate continued for hours, with council members expressing their fears and concerns while Zara defended. Not just Jake, but the possibility of peaceful coexistence. She could see the uncertainty in their faces, the way they wanted to believe her but couldn't overcome their fear of the unknown. Finally, her father raised his hand for silence. The human military has requested a meeting. They want to discuss the situation and attempt to resolve it peacefully. That's good news, Zara said hopefully. Perhaps her father replied. But they've also confined the soldier you befriended. It seems both our peoples are struggling with the idea of trust. Back at the human base, Jake sat in his detention cell, staring at the walls and wondering what was happening to Zara. Had she been imprisoned like he was? Was she facing punishment for their friendship? The thought of her suffering because of his choices was almost unbearable. Captain Williams appeared at his cell door, looking older and more tired than Jake had ever seen him. The aliens want to meet, Williams said. They've proposed a formal discussion to address the situation. That's a good sign, Jake said hopefully. Maybe, Williams replied. But Jake, I need you to understand something. Your actions have put us all in an impossible position. If this goes badly, if there's conflict between our peoples, some of that blood will be on your hands. Jake felt the weight of those words, but he also felt something else. A certainty that he'd made the right choice, even if the consequences were uncertain. Sir, he said quietly, what if it goes well? What if this is the beginning of something better than either of our peoples imagined? William stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. I guess we're about to find out. As both species prepared for their first official meeting, Jake and Zara remained separated, each hoping that the trust they'd built between them would be strong enough to survive the storm of fear and suspicion that threatened to tear their peoples apart. The meeting ground was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The Zephyrians had chosen a location halfway between the human base and their crystal city. A natural amphitheater where the planet's unique formations created a perfect circle of towering crystal spires. The morning light filtered through the translucent structures, casting rainbow patterns across the smooth ground below. Jake stood with his hands restrained behind his back, flanked by two guards as Captain Williams and Colonel Anderson prepared for what could be the most important conversation in human history. Despite everything that had happened, Jake felt a surge of hope as he looked around the meeting place. The Zephyrians had chosen a location that was beautiful rather than intimidating, a place that spoke of their desire for harmony, even in conflict. Remember, Rodriguez, Colonel Anderson said quietly, you've caused this situation. The least you can do is help us resolve it peacefully. Before Jake could respond, the air in the center of the amphitheater began to shimmer. The crystal spires hummed with increasing intensity, and suddenly figures began to materialize as if stepping through an invisible doorway. Jake's breath caught as he recognized the elegant forms of the Zephyrians, their robes flowing in the gentle breeze that seemed to follow them wherever they went. At the front of the group walked a tall, dignified figure who could only be Zara's father. His presence commanded respect, and Jake could see where Zara had inherited her natural grace and intelligence. Behind him came several other Zephyrians who were clearly council members, their bearing formal and watchful, and their walking beside. Her father, with her head held high, was Zara herself. Jake's heart leaped at seeing her safe, though he could tell from her posture that she was under as much scrutiny as he was. When their eyes met across the amphitheater, he saw a flash of relief and determination in her gaze. Despite everything they'd been through, despite the consequences they were facing, she still believed in what they had built together. Zara's father stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the space. To Jake's surprise, he spoke in accented but clear English. I am Council Leader Theron of the Zephyrian people, he said formally. We have come to discuss the unauthorized contact between our species and to determine how we should proceed. Colonel Anderson stepped forward to respond, but before he could speak, something unexpected happened. Zara moved to stand beside her father, her chin lifted in a gesture of quiet defiance that Jake recognized from their time together. Father, she said, and Jake could hear the strength in her voice that their friendship had helped her develop. Before we begin these formal discussions, I want to demonstrate something that I learned during my meetings with the human soldier Theron's. Expression grew concerned. Daughter, this is not the time for with respect. Father, this is exactly the time, Zara interrupted, gently but firmly. These humans fear us because they don't understand us. We fear them for the same reason. But understanding is possible. She walked to the center of the amphitheater, and Jake noticed that she carried something in her hands, one of the training knives he had given her weeks ago. Several of the human soldiers tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons. But Zara's movements were slow and deliberate, clearly non-threatening. "The human soldier Jake taught me about defense," she said, her voice carrying to everyone present. "Not about attack, not about conquest, but about protection. He showed me that strength can be gentle, that weapons can be tools of peace rather than destruction." She began to demonstrate the defensive techniques Jake had taught her, but as she moved, something magical happened. The crystal spires around the amphitheater began to resonate with her movements, creating a soft musical harmony that turned her demonstration into something like a dance. She was combining the human techniques Jake had taught her with her own, people's natural connection to their world. Jake watched in amazement as Zara showed both groups that their different approaches to life didn't have to be in conflict. Human practicality and Zephyrian harmony could work together to create something new and beautiful. When she finished, the amphitheater was silent except for the gentle humming of the crystals. Then Theron spoke, his voice filled with wonder. "Have learned to blend our ways with theirs," he said to his daughter, "to create something that honors both traditions." "Yes," Father Zara replied, "and this is just the beginning of what's possible if our peoples work together instead of fearing each other." Colonel Anderson looked stunned. "She learned all that from Rodriguez?" "It's not just learned," Jake said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "We learned from each other. She taught me about harmony, about working with the world instead of against it. I taught her about protection, about standing up for what you believe in. Together, we found something neither of our peoples had discovered. Alone." Captain Williams stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Rodriguez, what exactly did you discover during these meetings?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing that this moment could determine the future for both species. "I discovered that the Zephyrians aren't our enemies, sir. They're potential partners. They have technology that could help us build better relationships with the worlds we explore. We have knowledge that could help them reach beyond their own world to share their wisdom with others." Theron nodded slowly. "The human speaks truth. My daughter has shown me visions in the memory crystals, possible futures where our peoples work together. Humans learning to live in harmony with the worlds they explore. Zephyrians gaining the courage to venture beyond our crystal cities, but there are risks," Colonel Anderson pointed out. "Our species have very different values, different approaches to conflict." "There are always risks," Zara said, moving to stand halfway between the two groups. "But there are also opportunities. Jake showed me that sometimes the greatest risk is not taking any risk at all." Over the next several hours, the formal negotiations began in earnest. Jake and Zara were allowed to participate, sharing their experiences and insights from their weeks of cultural exchange. They described the gallery of memories, the possible futures they had seen, the practical ways their peoples could benefit from cooperation. Slowly, carefully, an agreement began to take shape. The humans would establish a small, permanent research station, but it would be focused on learning rather than military intelligence. The Zephyrians would share some of their crystal technology, particularly their methods for creating harmony between civilization and nature. Both species would exchange cultural ambassadors, with Jake and Zara serving as the first representatives of this new relationship. As the sun began to set over the crystal amphitheater, casting the entire space in warm golden light, Colonel Anderson made the final announcement. "Rodriguez," he said, "your actions were unauthorized and potentially dangerous. However, the results have exceeded anything we could have hoped for through traditional diplomatic channels." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but more importantly, he saw the smile that spread across Zara's face. "What happens now?" Captain Williams asked. Theron touched one of the crystal spires, and it began to glow with images of the possible futures Jake and Zara had seen weeks ago. Cities where human engineering worked in harmony with Zephyrian crystal technology. Explorers from both species traveling to new worlds together. Children from both cultures learning from each other's wisdom. "Now," Theron said, We begin building the future our children have shown us is possible. As the meeting concluded and both groups prepared to return to their respective homes, Jake and Zara found themselves walking together toward the center of the amphitheater. For the first time in weeks, they could speak openly without the weight of secrecy between them. "We did it," Zara said softly, her eyes bright with tears of relief and joy. "We started it," Jake corrected gently. "The real work begins now." She nodded, understanding the challenges that lay ahead. Building trust between entire species would be much harder than building friendship between two individuals. But looking around the crystal amphitheater, seeing the way the light played through the formations, their peoples would now share. Both of them felt confident that they had created something strong enough to last. Their friendship had become a bridge between worlds. And now it was time to help others cross that bridge toward a future neither species could have imagined alone.